Hi, this is Hyperwave. I'm Leah Wald. I'm here with Tyler Jenks, and today we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping and talk about overall philosophy. So we're going to keep it really brief, closely look at really the most important lines right now for Bitcoin, including for Hyperwave with current price action. Lots of great questions from people, specifically if Hyperwave breaks down at 3, doesn't mean if it's all over. Also, we're going to do some surfing shirts and just hang out. It was snowing last night, so I'm kind of trying to evoke some warm weather so that I can get back out to the ocean. Tyler used to live in Hawaii, so you know what I'm talking about. All right, Tyler, I'll send it over to you.
Great, very good. Thank you, Leah. I'm going to pull up a chart just to get started here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of the tweets that I sent out this morning in terms of overall philosophy. And it will help to use the chart to discuss the philosophy. So before we get into the chart and the price action today, I made the point that I wanted to be very clear of pulling all together, not only the technical analysis, but also the fundamental analysis and the philosophical background that I take. And I know Leah shares a lot of the same views, but we differ on a number of things, as does everybody in this space. So since I do the bulk of the talking when I'm talking technical analysis and hyperwave, I wanted to be very clear about my overall view, which is very simple. Number one, I believe that Bitcoin is here to stay, regardless of what happens in the short or the intermediate term with price. Number two, I do not believe that the vast majority of cryptos are here to stay. I believe that over some time period, almost all of them are going to disappear, and the emphasis will shift back to the original Bitcoin model. Number three, am not yet decided if any of the cryptos are going to be able to compete. And that's more controversial. And we've got maximalists on one side of that question. We've got true believers about various utilities of the crypto space on the other side. And I'm torn between the two at this point. We need, I believe, a lot more evidence. Number four, thank you all for the terrific questions about Hyperwave. Many are critical, many are simply questioning, but we've had dozens of people doing their own work and coming up with very interesting observations. One of the most recent is another Hyperwave that I had missed in the stock NVIDIA. And we will look at that, not today, but as we look at more and more individual securities and cryptos that could and look as if they are in hyperwaves. But going to the chart, I want to simplify things. I have actually added a couple of new lines to this chart, but I've taken many of the other ones off. The theme of today is stuck in the middle again. And where we are stuck, in my opinion, is above this line right here, which is the phase 3 trend line. And below what I call the field, which are these two parallel horizontal trend lines at 11,100 and at 10,100. The price action is stuck between those, and it will resolve itself one way or the other simply by going sideways. It doesn't need to go up or down at this point. But if it does go up or down, it's going to find strong support on the phase 3 hyperwave trend line and strong resistance if it goes up, as we saw yesterday with my miscalculated, mistimed optimism of a potential break above the 10,100 line and the 50-day moving average, which turned out to be a complete bust yesterday morning. But it helps me to emphasize how powerful this field is that runs between 10,100 and 11,100. Think of it not as two lines, but as a solid wall. And when you're above that wall, it will become support. But just as occurred here and here and back here, it needs to clear that wall by a significant amount because there are additional overhead resistance lines that I am not showing for simplicity today. Okay, so the questions I keep getting have to do with a misunderstanding, probably a miscommunication on my part of this phase 3 trend line. So I'm simply going to make this a little bigger for now to include the entire hyperwave up through today. And this is the phase 3 line. And this line is, if you remember, if you've seen these before, the third line of a hyperwave. The first one is flat. The second one goes up at a certain angle. That's a phase 2 line. And I'm not even showing that on this chart because the phase 3 is so important at this juncture. And the phase 3 line is simply the next acceleration up in a move. Once you have got a phase 3 line, 85 out of 100 of these hyperwaves will go through the complete 7-phase move. So it's important because the probabilities are now great that we will go through a 4, 5, 6, and 7 at some point in the future. And the debate has been, was this a 4? Was this a 5? Was this a 6? And are we in a 7? And I've been arguing, I don't believe so. I believe that all of this action is phase 3, ready for a movement up, which may not even be a phase 4. I'll explain that in just a little bit. But what I want to talk about today is what happens if the phase 3 line is broken. A lot of your comments are, how can I say that Bitcoin is here to stay if we're this close to breaking down, which will prove that we are in either phase 2 or a phase 7, going all the way back to the beginning? And my answer is, when a hyperwave ends, that does not make the thing that is creating the hyperwave go away. All the hyperwaves that I've shown you, IBM back in the 1920s and 30s, General Electric, all of them had wonderful futures after the hyperwave was completed and we fell all the way below the phase 1 trend line, which is the only thing a phase 7 does. It takes you back to the beginning, and it either resets into another hyperwave, or more probably, it simply goes on with the fundamentals of whatever the asset class is taking over, which might mean just growth over a number of years. It might not mean another hyperwave. I believe that this is such a powerful fundamental case for worldwide finance that if we do break down into a phase 7 that takes us below $1,000, that we will very probably quickly reset into another hyperwave and go right into another phase 2, 3, 4, etc. But I don't believe that's what we're doing. So let's go back to the smaller chart. I believe what we are doing now is I'm going to take this to a daily chart, is we are climbing the phase 3 line, and we have resistance at 10,100 and at 11,100, which form a field let me do that one again. It's very difficult drawing these lines sometimes. Close enough. Okay. Which forms a top, a ceiling, a wall, a shield above the price action. This price action goes on over the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days after breaking back down through it. Now I'm going to put the moving averages back on with an explanation of why I'm using these particular ones. This is a 52-day moving average. I just changed it a little from the 50. I've used 52 over the years. It's close enough to a 50 that most people use, but I like the idea of it, an entire either year if you use 52-week or 52-day period. And that now is below the 10,100 line. The 52-day moving average has fallen below it. Also, a very important aspect of declining tops, and I'm going to put this one right back, because what happens with the declining trend line is that as time goes on, it gets easier and easier to break that trend line, particularly if you've got support coming up with a longer trend line below it, which is the phase 3 trend line. Okay, what does all of that mean for price today, right where we are? We are above or right on that declining trend line. If we post another daily tomorrow to the right and another to the right of that, we quickly get above this trend line, the declining trend line from the top. And when you have established a hold above that line begins to decrease or diminish in strength. We have not done that yet. We're still playing above and below it. But as time goes on, it will fall away sharply. That's an important point. A second important point is a trend line or a moving average coming down after a big run up has a downward slope, which means the longer we can go sideways, that moving average gets lower and lower and lower and begins to build the ability to get above it more easily. Our problem has been that we've got these two horizontal, powerful trend lines that were all coming together at the same place, that the descending trend line off the top, the moving average coming down, and these two horizontal trend lines all met. And
Tyler,
that, yes, please.
Good question that we got from the live chat. If you use the phase 3 as a constantly running floor, what would the constantly running top be, ignoring the buildup in December?
There was none. The buildup in December, I'm going to go back to the weekly. The buildup in December was simply a powerful move in a hyperwave above a trend line, a phase line. And I believe that was the phase 3 trend line. You will often get powerful moves up, such as back here, which don't look powerful until you go and take a look at actually what the prices did. In this case, above the phase 3 trend line, we went from $1,800 to $4,900, well above the trend line. In this case, back here above the phase 2 trend line, we went from below $900 up to almost $3,000. So one of the unique features of Hyperwave is, and the reason I called it a hyperwave, is it's simply not an expansion of price. It's a powerful expansion of price that almost sometimes goes hyperbolic itself within a phase. That has nothing to do, unless it's a true phase 3, 4, and 5, with the actual underlying powerful structure of phase 2 and phase 3. So there was no top at 1966. The reason it stopped where it did had to do with all kinds of other technical factors, such as the MACD, the RSI, all the oscillators that became so overbought by the tremendous sentiment shift as we went into SegWit, and SegWit dropped away, and people realized Bcash was not going to replace Bitcoin. Number one. Number two, we had the CME and the CBOE coming out in December with a listing of Bitcoin. And so price, from a technical point of view, simply got too high and couldn't be supported. And whenever that occurs, with or without a hyperwave, you will get a retracement.
Tyler?
And that's exactly what we saw. Yeah.
On that, as you go through the different phases of the hyperwave, will it change the nature that investors have with Bitcoin, if we're talking specifically about Bitcoin? As an example, potentially changing how people see it as a store of value versus the hodling mentality versus, as it's, we talked about on Tone's show this morning, derivatives contracts, CMEC, everything. I guess just comment on, as each hyperwave phase materializes and or doesn't, how will this affect investors as well as others in the space understanding of the asset?
Well, that's a terrific question. And if I can summarize it, it's saying as price of anything develops in a hyperwave, what is the psychological or sentimental shift that takes place? And unfortunately, there's good and bad news along that front. But let's be very clear about something. Nobody knows what hyperwaves are. We've got a couple of thousand followers on YouTube. We've got a couple of thousand followers on Twitter, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of a tiny, tiny group of investors in a much larger universe. What I'm saying is that a lot of people use technical trading tools like the sequential or the TD system, like RSIs, like even stop and reverse points and trend lines. And because it's universally known and used and has been for decades, there is an assumption about each of those programs, but nobody has been exposed to Hyperwave before other than the listeners of this show. And I've kept it under wraps for, as I've said before, selfish reasons over the last 30 years, because I've used it to manage a lot of money for very large institutions. But when Leah and I began talking about bringing this to the fore for people in the crypto space, it was based on my fundamental belief that Bitcoin is so special and so important that I wanted to marry the tools that I had developed for Hyperwave to this space and to get the word out so that others could use and benefit from it. And that's what we're doing. So my answer to that question is, I believe that over time, more and more people will understand how useful of a tool this is in terms of getting in or out of even the most optimistic asset classes at the right time, with some sort of a map in front of you, so you don't have to be either guessing or jumping in and out of positions because of confusion, or the opposite extreme, which is hodling. To me, it makes no sense to simply buy and hold with the faith that this will be the first hyperwave that never goes through 5, 6, and 7 and starts over again. A lot of people disagree with that, but I believe until I've got the proof that this thing is going to 100,000 or 1,000,000 without any more massive corrections, it just doesn't make sense to me not to use this as a tool for timing large movements in or out of the market for periods of time. And that's, remember, there are 4 up phases and there are 3 negative phases, 1, 5, and 7. But the other 4, as long as they are going, you can be fully invested in this particular asset class. But be aware of what 1, 5, and 7 mean and take appropriate action.
Tyler.
So, yes.
So just since this is a housekeeping episode, which is a bit fun, just for everyone on the channel, we did a fun, pretty feverish video on hodling and specifically our views. So as Tyler just said, we actually are in agreement that we think hodling and this conversation around it, for the most part, is, I'm going to say it, bullshit. So which gets us in a lot of trouble simply because we are traders, right? So in its very nature, right, it doesn't make sense if you're trying to make money on Bitcoin that you wouldn't pay attention to buying the dips, selling that, when appropriate, and especially when we're talking about Hyperwave, very specifically following these phases in order to understand when to maximize your financial gains, right, and when to get out appropriately. But the value of the understanding of hodling, I personally believe, that Tyler and I discussed this as well, although he can push back on me, is important in that the nature of understanding that we believe in the future of Bitcoin and in ensuring that we are there to help the future of Bitcoin be realized in a positive and more valid way with, increased liquidity in the market, increased value, to say again, validity. And that's only going to happen if, more financial institutions such as the CME, CBOE, if more intelligent investors enter the space, if you guys and the whole community continues to develop Bitcoin, right? If the fact that Bitcoin and blockchain are still in their nascency, which is fantastic because it has so much opportunity to grow and to thrive, right? And that means that they will increase in store value, it will increase in price. And therefore, hodling just for hodling, right? Just holding it and not taking heed of when the markets are saying that you should be selling is not a smart financial advice, right? And you're on this channel to understand how to make money off of this. So
those are all terrific, very important points, and I appreciate each one of them. It sounds like there's a bunch of inconsistencies, and there possibly are in the things I've been saying. For example, if I really believe that Bitcoin is here to stay, then hodling makes an infinite amount of sense. But remember my caveat. That is a belief that I have. I think I'm pretty experienced. I think I'm very measured in the way I look at asset classes and the history of prices. But to make a statement like this particular asset class is here to stay is based on faith and a fundamental belief in certain principles about the world financial situation. But that's all it is. It's faith, it's belief. Believe me, if back in November and December, Bcash had worked, Bitcoin could very possibly have been in deep, deep trouble. There are 1,000, 2,000 different cryptocurrencies that are attacking the Bitcoin principles. And because of that, and because regulators can do some pretty remarkable things in every area, including the digital area, either individually by country or universally, because of a deep belief that they don't want to lose control over the financial system. They don't want it to shift too quickly into a new frontier. I believe it is intelligent and it is wise to consider this asset, along with all other assets, to be one that you must consider your wealth and your financial future conservatively when trading in it. If we are correct that this will continue until the 21 millionth Bitcoin has been produced, and then continue beyond that because of mass adoption, then we can all benefit greatly, regardless of if you were a hodler or hodler from day one, or if you acted in a measured means as Bitcoin gains strength. You might come out a little bit less if you get in and out at various times. You will definitely come out a lot less if you jump in and out in between cryptocurrencies and Bitcoins all of the time. But if you can use some principles such as short-term movements in and out based on the sequential system, and long-term movements in and out based on what to me has proven itself for almost a century in terms of the long-term movement of certain types of bubble activity that I call hyperwaves, I believe you will sleep much better at night, and you will go through months, quarters, and years in a much stronger position until the year 2060 comes along and the 21 millionth Bitcoin is finally produced. So,
Tyler?
yes, please.
So this is interesting. Thank you. I think it's Maui on the live chat for us to put up the Ichimoku cloud. So if you can you see my screen, Tyler?
I will be able to in a second. Yes.
Okay. So it was mentioned that it looks like a hyperwave. And so if you wanted to, take a look and make a comment, I have it here.
I don't see the cloud here. I see the numbers that look like sequential numbers. Am I looking at the wrong thing?
I'm not sure how to make this line bigger, to be fully honest. We may have to come back to this question. But you see
Well,
there?
but let me say this. It is fascinating to me how when one major hyperwave is taking place, many auxiliary correlated either volume or other assets that correlate to the main one will act similarly. It does not surprise me in the least that things that measure movement or show movement in the form of supply or demand also will take hyperwave action. One of the things that's becoming very apparent on the number of hyperwaves that are occurring in the technical space right now, NVIDIA, Netflix, Amazon, Tesla, are all in the early stages of hyperwaves. Now, that has nothing to do with Bitcoin, but it has a lot to do with what's going on with Moore's Law and exponential growth based on technology. So, what you will find, that's why I said I am so appreciative of the people that are finding hyperwaves in a lot of different areas. And that's what we want to do on this channel. So I will take a look at what you are referring to when we go off screen, and then we'll comment on that later. But I'm not surprised if that kind of action is taking place. All right. So just concluding in terms of price, we are sitting at 9,051. We are below a 52-day moving average. We are right on, but we have been above in the last day, the descending line from 19,666. We are above the phase 3 trend line, and we're coming to some very critical junctures. I would love it if price goes sideways, builds up head of steam, and is able to crack through the 52-day, through the 10,100, 11,100, old high at 11,780, and put all of this confusion behind us. If that doesn't happen, if we go into another slide and take out the phase 3 line on a weekly closing basis, then we're going to drop down, in my opinion, to 4,000 approximately to the phase 2 line. And if that breaks, we are going to drop below 1,000, and we will very probably start another move at that point. And going back to the earlier question of what will the hyperwave action do to sentiment and to emotion, if that were to occur, I think a lot of people will begin considering hyperwave with more reverence than they have, including the hodlers, because it gives them a reason not to ping pong back and forth between great wealth and diminishing wealth and starting over again. That's what hyperwave brings to the picture. And with that, thank you for listening. We went way beyond what I thought we would, but thank you for the questions. And back to you, Leah.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the very thought-provoking questions in the live chat. Absolutely. Thanks again, Ma, for bringing up what looks absolutely fascinating. We'll definitely get back to you on that. And yeah, just everybody, thanks again. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.